My name is Robin Paris. I'm a professor of art at Watkins College of Art and Design. It's a small art school in Nashville, Tennessee. So I'm really excited about this because we have some panelists here all in the same room, which is an honor to be with. They've done either research or working within or have actually experienced the justice system in the United States, and so we're very lucky to have them. I wanted to tell you a few things. I went into the prison on Thursday night. We go in every Thursday night for about 2.5 hours. And this Thursday night, I asked them specifically, what can I tell these people who I will be speaking to? And they gave me a little list of things to tell you. First of all, that they made this work in a kind of faith. And it's mostly a faith in the audience, because these are people that have had they are used to disappointment, and this disappointment started often at a very early age. And so they have a faith in their audience, and they want to thank you for coming. They also wanted to say that if you've ever wondered about someone on death row or had a question, you can contact these people. Their addresses aren't hard to find, and they would love to talk about the judicial system or what it's like or with their experiences. They would love to talk to you. And they wanted you to realize that they have very little support in their lives, and sometimes they have jobs, they don't pay much, but they do appreciate very much the kinds of programs that some of us and some volunteers have brought in, because they don't have much at their disposal, as you can imagine. So thank you very much for coming, and I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Tom Williams.
Okay, so I wanted to just very briefly talk a little bit about the show overall, and then introduce our speakers and let them talk. I'm hoping that we can have a kind of conversation afterwards. And a lot of this is going to be for the internet. It's going to be posted on the internet. So if you do have any questions that you think are important vis-a-vis the show or any of the issues raised today, I hope you bring them up so we can kind of allow for this to reflect on the show and on this panel for anyone who might watch it online. So we conceived of this show in response to Apex's call for unsolicited proposals. And we thought of this idea of having them design memorials for themselves. For men on death row, they're confronted with the question of death. Some of them address it in their work, but with the specter of death all the time. And we wanted to make people aware of this kind of condition of living death that they all endure, and the hope that they have sustained despite those circumstances. And so that was more or less the rationale for the show. If there are any questions about that, we can maybe talk about it at the end, but I just wanted you all, those of you who maybe haven't seen the show yet, I wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of know at least in a sketch what the show is about. But I want to just begin by introducing our speakers. And I'll introduce them in detail one by one if that's okay. But the first person to speak here is Lisa Guenther. And Lisa Guenther's been working with the same group of guys on death row in Tennessee for 4 years now. It is through her efforts, through an exhibition she curated at Vanderbilt in the beginning of 2013 that we became involved in this project in the first place. And she's been one of our guiding lights in all of this. She is an associate professor of philosophy at Vanderbilt, and she's done extensive writing about issues of mass incarceration, about solitary confinement, and other issues related to her work in prison and on death row. We're really, really happy to have her here. She certainly has been a touchstone for us in realizing this project and everything else we've done over the past few years. So if you could just join me in welcoming her.
Hi, and thank you so much for coming out tonight. I just want to begin. I'm going to say a few things to put the work in this show into context, a broader context of the death penalty from a kind of philosophical perspective. But I wanted to acknowledge before I begin the role that Angela Davis played in sort of orienting my own work as a philosopher towards issues of mass incarceration, and I think for providing a context for some of the pieces in this show. When I first started teaching at Vanderbilt, Angela Davis came and gave a month-long seminar, special graduate seminar at Vanderbilt's philosophy department, and it was on slavery, and she began the course on slavery with the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery except for those who have been duly convicted of a crime. And so in a way, the 13th Amendment doesn't abolish slavery completely, it sanctions a certain form of slavery, namely prison slavery. And so Davis's book, Are Prisons Obsolete?, poses this question: what would it mean to abolish slavery once and for all with no exceptions? And what implications would that have for the way we think about criminal justice in relation to social justice in our society? And so the work by Wayne Harold Nichols on this side of the wall here, the final panel is asking viewers to imagine a world beyond prisons, and a world in which all of the prisons have been dismantled brick by brick, and those bricks have been used to build a kind of forum for conversation and for different kinds of social encounter. So as a philosopher, I approach issues of the death penalty not just as issues of social justice, but also as issues of epistemic injustice. And by epistemic injustice, I mean it's a concept that was developed or introduced by a philosopher named Miranda Fricker, but it's really drawing on a lot of ideas from Black feminist epistemology and social justice work that has developed over years to articulate some kind of specific harm to people in their capacity as a knower. And so Fricker identifies two forms of epistemic injustice. One is testimonial injustice, which is a form of injustice that is oriented towards someone's capacity to speak, to give testimony, and to be heard or listened to. So it's about the silencing of voices, the exclusion of certain voices from the public domain, the discrediting of certain forms of knowledge, and the marginalization or exclusion of ways of knowing the world. And I think that the death penalty in this country operates as on multiple levels as a form of epistemic injustice, and that this show, in part, is a kind of a collective work of epistemic justice, creating a forum for people who are condemned to death and who have spent, in many cases, all of their adult lives in prison, to speak and to be heard, and to articulate something of what they know of the world and of their experience of the world to an audience that will not hopefully immediately discredit them based on who they are perceived to be. But there are also other ways in which the death penalty operates as a form of testimonial injustice in this country, and the lethal injection protocols, I think, are a really good example of this. So the standard lethal injection protocol consists of an anesthetic, which is supposed to put the prisoner to sleep and make them immune to feeling any sort of pain, followed by a paralytic, which paralyzes their body so that they cannot move or express any pain if in the procedure they either voluntarily or involuntarily would be provoked to move. And the third drug is an electrolyte that is meant to stop the heart. And so built into what is the standardized and increasingly difficult to realize lethal injection protocol, it's difficult because many pharmaceutical companies have banned the use of their drugs for lethal injection. And so we've seen all of these botched executions in which there are horrible, fairly evident signs of suffering during execution that actually were foreclosed in terms of their expression in the standard lethal injection protocol. I see this as a form of epistemic injustice because it is blocking the testimony of the body in pain, and making it actually impossible for the prisoner to communicate voluntarily or involuntarily during the process. But there's also a way in which lethal injection protocols, especially the sort of performance of a very sanitized, medicalized procedure in which it looks like someone is on a gurney, they are in a hospital-looking setting, and they just peacefully, quietly, close their eyes and go to sleep and never wake up. That performance itself is a form of epistemic injustice in the sense that it is foreclosing a kind of critical questioning on the part of the public about what is actually going on here, and about a kind of knowing of that and a naming of that situation as a form of state violence, and not merely a kind of medical procedure that is curing a problem by making a person go away. So there's even one more sense in which our lethal injection protocols perform a kind of testimonial injustice, and that is there have been legal constitutional objections to the lethal injection protocol, and one key case is Bays v. Reese, which was a case in Kentucky where prisoners were asking for EKG monitors to and other kind of medical technologies to monitor the process of lethal injection and to try to minimize the chances that they would experience pain during execution. And their request was denied by the Supreme Court, but Ruth Ginsburg, in an effort to try to mitigate the chance of experiencing pain during execution, suggested a very simple procedure that she called a consciousness check, which could be performed between the administration of the anesthetic and the paralytic to make sure that the anesthetic had had its full effect, and to try to minimize the chance that the prisoner would be paralyzed before they were completely rendered incapable of experiencing pain. And the consciousness check is a kind of, I think, to me, surreal and elaborate procedure in which the warden is supposed to come up to the anesthetized prisoner, to shake them gently, to call their name, and to brush their eyelashes with their hands to see. it's like, if you imagine this very intimate bodily encounter that the warden is being asked to perform to foreclose the possibility that, or to sort of guarantee that this person is now incapable of feeling pain, and so we can go ahead with the procedure without having any kind of misgivings about whether there's the procedure of putting someone to death is also going to cause suffering for them. And this is, I think, a form of epistemic justice in the sense that it recruits and mobilizes the warden's own capacities for feeling, for kind of attuning themselves bodily to another person, and for reading that body for signs of awareness or lack of awareness, to ultimately put that person to death and to sanction a procedure in which the putting to death itself is going to be obscured by the various rituals involved in the procedure. So for me, there's plenty more to say about epistemic injustice, and there's another form of epistemic injustice that this philosopher Miranda Fricker highlights, and I'll just say a few words very briefly about that and then pass the mic on to Kathleen. So the first form of epistemic injustice is hermeneutical injustice, which is testimonial injustice, which is injustice to someone's voice, sort of canceling and silencing their voice. And the other form of epistemic injustice that Fricker highlights is hermeneutical injustice, which is the lack or the denial of a framework of concepts and of meaning to make sense of your experience. And I think here too we see, so Fricker's example of hermeneutic injustice is the experience of women who are harassed by their bosses prior to the articulation of the concept of sexual harassment. You know, you might feel like, oh, my boss is really a creep, or that was really inappropriate. But until we had the concept of sexual harassment, it was difficult to totally make sense of that experience and to name it and to see that it's not just something happening to you as an individual, but it's a thing in the world. And so the lack of concepts to name patterns of social experience or practices is, for Fricker, a form of hermeneutic injustice. And I think Michelle Alexander's notion of the new Jim Crow is another excellent example of a name that helps us to make sense of a whole pattern of different things going on in the world, and to see it as a pattern and not just like the individual experiences of a series of young black men being swept up into prisons through the war on drugs. Once we are able to kind of understand that pattern in terms of the new Jim Crow, the possibilities for intervening in that problem open up that weren't there before. And so I think we need, and part of the work that we do in our own philosophy group, which meets on Wednesday nights at Riverbend Prison with many of the prisoners who have contributed work to this exhibition today, is a work of trying to counter hermeneutic injustice and to come up with sorts of concepts and frameworks for meaning that would help to make sense of the death penalty, not just as a narrowly moral issue, but as a social justice issue and as an issue that is interconnected with the same sorts of issues of poverty and racism and social exclusion raised by mass incarceration. So that's what we do in the prison. We alternate days where we read texts together, such as the new Jim Crow, and discuss those, and days when we work on specific social justice projects that have been identified by the men inside as issues that are of importance to them. And in that sense, I think both the art group and our philosophy group is a collective effort to make sense of the world and to counter these patterns of epistemic injustice, which are ultimately forms of social injustice. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
So I'd next like to introduce Cathleen Price, who lives and works in New York, and has spent her whole life, her whole working life, dedicated to addressing issues of mass incarceration and social justice, particularly in relation to people in prison. She's worked for many years with the Equal Justice Initiative, and she teaches also at Columbia University in American Studies. And I think it was particularly important that she be part of this for Abu Ali, who has the piece in the back. You participated in his case, I believe, and he said, when we told him that he would be coming, he said, yeah, she's great, she's official. He said, she don't play around, is what he said. So we're really happy to have her come and speak as well, and to talk about issues surrounding, legal issues surrounding the death penalty. So, thank you.
Thank you. I am going to try not to take too much time, so you all are deputized to just block. I run along. Thank you for that introduction. I am a lawyer. I am one of the lawyers in the movement. It's a particular honor to have been invited here because of my relationship with Abu Ali. When I think I first got involved in his case, I think it was 1997 or 98, and he was in, the details are not interesting, but he was in federal court, which is a very, very important place to be in terms of having your rights recognized. And I was young, and I was working under Brian, and having had the opportunity to sort of drill into what his case is about and what he is about really did sort of launch me. I mean, I wanted to be a death penalty lawyer, and then I started actually doing the work, and as many of you know, whatever you do, when you start doing the actual work, it can be different. But having met Abu Ali so early in my career was a great blessing. And I will return to his case in a moment, but I did want to say it's really, that's my number one, sort of, it's peculiarly pleasant to be here. But the second thing is to be sitting here next to Ndume. You know, we were just sort of talking about this. We have so many friends in prison, and I have had the honor of sort of walking along with so many men and women. It's like such a peculiar thrill and honor to be sitting next to a triumph. Yes. Okay, and with that, I will turn to my nuts and bolts, because as a lawyer, I have a whole thing where I feel like everybody who is thinking about the death penalty needs to know certain things about it. Especially, I teach in American Studies, and the project of the American Studies Department at Columbia is to educate / train. They don't call it that at Columbia, but it's a kind of training people so that they can be responsible adults in a democracy. Democracy only works if people have information and they are outfitted to pay attention to it. And so we are in the midst of what is a very promising, broad conversation about criminal justice reform, penal reform, and reform of us, right? Reform of what we have invested in punishment. And I think that with particular respect to how we utilize the death penalty, we need to know exactly what we're talking about when we talk about the constitutional aspect of the injustice. So I'm gonna spend a little time on the numbers. Okay, so a lot of this stuff is, it's in the news every day, so you probably know it, but I wanna say it again so that we have it framed. We have seen since the early 70s a 500% increase in our prison population. So, there were 300,000 people in prison in the early 70s, and there are now 2.3 million. There are an additional 6 million people presently who live on probation or parole. Sounds great, but if you have anybody in your family who is on parole, it's really difficult to live that right. It is a punishment. It's only good if you are comparing it to these jurisdictions that have just abolished parole and leave people in prison until they die of what is called natural causes. Okay, I'll skip some of the rest of these, but how we got there was the war on drugs, which you alluded to. It was through I feel like I watched this and I still can't quite believe it, the way we expand isn't the word. It's like we built a canyon to capture juveniles in the adult criminal justice system. And so dozens of thousands of people who would not have been sentenced to carceral settings for poor juvenile behavior are now in prison. And then the expanded use of the life without parole sentence, which used to be a relatively rare sentence, as it still is in places in Europe, but it became very common for violent crimes, especially when we expanded the use of the death penalty. So in the 90s, this Clinton thing, people love Clinton, but my heart was broken by Clinton when I was, the 22-year-old with the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act and the way in which he incentivized all these jurisdictions to just make the death penalty statute wide open, and practically speaking, almost every homicide can be charged capitally nowadays. So we have that, and because we have the specter of the death penalty hanging over so much, it has made life without parole seem like a lenient option. Okay, maybe we can talk about that back in the conversation. All right, so the death penalty. We currently have I just checked these numbers a little while ago, we have just over 3,000 people on the road, which that number has actually been steady for a little while. We've had 1,414 executions to date, and we've had a total of, this is early September, 155 formal exonerations. And formal exonerations mean people about whom the government will, in one form or fashion, concede that that person did not commit the crime for which he was convicted and sentenced to death. Now, there are any number of men and women who have not been formally exonerated and were probably executed, notwithstanding the fact that we pretty much now understand that they were innocent. So just to put that in perspective, that's over 1 in 10 of getting it way wrong. If our airlines had a fail rate like that, you would never get on an airline that crashed at that rate. You would never use a stroller. In this part of New York, these sort of fancy strollers now, you would never use a stroller that accidentally collapsed like that, because it might cause bruises. But we use a death penalty that fails fundamentally with that frequency. Riverbend, I think, is distinct prison, the programming that's available there, some of which we're hearing about, and we were talking about the lawns. Death rows across most of the United States, and this includes federal death row, don't look like that. There is no programming for most death sentence prisoners, notwithstanding the fact that we know that it's going to take quite some time before any death sentence would be actually carried out. When I started practice, actually I was an intern, so when I was in the early 90s, there were crafts, there was educational programs, there were actually drug treatment programs, even on death rows in prisons, but those are all gone, and they are gone in the name of punishment. They are gone in the name of punishment. Many people are incarcerated on death row in places that are a long, long way from where they're from, and I mean, it's its own kind of isolation. Prison is isolating. That's part of what we're doing with it, right? Is we're cutting people off, as if that's something we should be doing. But death rows are uniquely isolating because they are they allow most prisoners, typical death rows allow most prisoners very little time outside of the cell, time in any kind of fellowship with other prisoners, especially if what you're looking for is non-Christian fellowship. Christian fellowship is available in many, many southern prisons, but if you're looking for any other kind of fellowship, it's absolutely not available. Isolation, one thing I forgot to mention. So we have, there are 22 states now that don't have the death penalty, and the rest of them have the death penalty, but the bulk of that is in the old South states, or excuse me, the old Confederacy. But the one thing that I feel like people don't often recognize is that the federal government utilizes the death penalty in service of its federal interest. And so every single United States citizen lives in a death penalty jurisdiction. And no one should feel like, oh, I've made my decision that I'm going to be living in Vermont. Because Vermont is a great place, and there's a lot of democracy. But there is a federal death penalty, and I represented a man facing the death penalty in Vermont for many, many years. I currently represent a man who is facing the death penalty whose crime was committed in Staten Island. You know, a lot of New Yorkers think we got rid of the death penalty in New York in 95, I think it was. But no, everyone needs to be mindful because we all live in death penalty jurisdictions. Okay. Two aspects of our death penalty that I think are distinctive, and again, I think one we should be have some familiarity with. And the first is race and racism. You know, many people. Well, let me just say this, in case you didn't know. Racism is the single most corrupting factor of the United States death penalty. It is the thing that makes it has the most power to determine what the outcome of any judicial process, any criminal process. Race is the thing, and it works as follows. As I said, most of the states that use the death penalty would look just like the Confederacy. They map along the old slave states. It's mostly the Old South. We call it the Death Belt. The one big fat exception is California, which has a fairly big death row, but they don't ever execute anybody. So, you know, we're holding the road there. But in, you know, Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana, Tennessee, Alabama, and all the way up, plus Florida. That is where the bulk of our residents are. And the death rows today look a lot like they did back during slavery. So just to sort of step back into history, you know, before the end of the Civil War, basically all crimes committed by blacks were punished more severely and prosecuted more frequently than the same behaviors when committed by non-black people, white people. And we still see that in theory, the 14th Amendment was supposed to abolish this discrimination, but nevertheless, the problem still obtains. And what we see now are extreme racial disparities in, you know, even the very modern use of the death penalty. And by that I mean the death penalty in the last 10 years. I am currently working on building a litigation out of Texas, which Houston, Texas is famous for being a very, very active death penalty jurisdiction. They seek death all the time. Lots and lots and lots of prisoners have been executed because of the Texas district attorney. They have not sentenced, Houston County, or Harris County, which is Houston, has not sought a death sentence against a single single white defendant in over 10 years. Not a single one. The county is 60% white. The homicides, okay, so that's an example of that. But more broadly speaking, the way the racism plays out is we see disparities in race of the defendant, like I said. So black defendants do have more risk of getting the death penalty than white defendants, but where you see the profound skew is in the race of the victim. So in cases where the victim is white, a person is way more likely to get the death penalty than in cases where the victim is black. And I have seen these data sort of, graphically portrayed, and it is stunning. You would look at one of these graphs and you would conclude that black lives do not matter much at all. Because in most places, blacks are much more likely to be victims of homicide. But in some places where it is so rare for cases in which black victims to have been prosecuted severely that it's called colloquially misdemeanor murder, where no one goes to prison at all. There's like a fine, like you have to cover the funeral expenses. So that's those are the racial disparities that are historic, but they are enduring. So when people say that the death penalty is shaped by race and that the death, some people will say death penalty is racism, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about who is exposed to it and who gets it. I don't think I need to go into the details of how this plays out, but I'm happy to in the conversation if people want to. But basically, it's about prosecutorial charging decisions. So again, you want to pay attention to what your prosecutors are doing. They act in your name. They are elected officials. You have to look at who do they choose to prosecute capitally? Why are they doing that? And I actually think people are a little bit more, popular culture is a little bit more conscious around this because of all this, what's going on in this police brutality, where the prosecutors are not really wanting to seek indictments. That sort of thing. I think people are there's a heightening of awareness around prosecutors as elected officials. The second feature about the death aspect of our death penalty that I want people to know and to know at the ready is poverty. Brian Stevenson has said frequently, you are far more likely to get the death penalty if you are poor and innocent than if you are rich and guilty. And what he means by that is the quality of the counsel. Poor people are marginalized and despised in this country on many different layers and at many different points throughout their lives. But at the moment when they are facing criminal charges and have no money for an attorney, they are appointed an attorney pursuant to our constitutional guarantees. Unfortunately, in many jurisdictions, the quality of that counsel is dreadful. It is dreadful because our municipalities and our jurisdictions don't want to fund that service. It's dreadful because with some pockets of exceptions, there isn't a respect for the defense function. I feel like we've become really pro-police here. I mean, just our popular culture. And there isn't, like, people think people think of me as a defense lawyer. Think I'm like a problem. And I'm thinking, no, it's an honor to be a defense lawyer. And at the Revolution, we believed in the defense function, right? The wicked accused, the godly defend. This is from Proverbs. But the culture has changed around that, and our civic culture has changed around that. Coincident with that is our contempt for people who have been accused of crimes, right? This tough on crime thing has taken on a life of its own, and there is enduring and pervasive contempt for people even before they've been convicted that it dulls people's lawyers' willingness to really investigate cases. We were just discussing this. I'm looking at this tower here. There's these Faulkner books up there, and I had a case that was right out of Faulkner. I mean, it was from a county in Alabama in which there was no McDonald's. It was that rural. Have you ever been anywhere with no McDonald's? And the victim was white, and the defendant was black, and he was my client, and his family had been working for the victim's family since emancipation, and they had been working for his family since before emancipation. And in that case, the lawyer, his trial lawyer, his court-appointed trial lawyer, was 30 miles away and would never come to visit the client, would never come to talk to the client. And if you're not willing to do that, you're not willing to investigate what really happened. You will never know who the client is. In the capital cases, your job, my job, is to not only understand and know my client, but to teach the sentencer who he is. The death penalty isn't just a punishment for a crime. It's a decision that a life should be extinguished. It's a decision about the whole person. And in order for that decision to be intelligent, the sentencer has to know who this person is, at a minimum, if that's possible. It's a problem. But the lawyer in that case wouldn't go 30 miles. Let's just say he got the death penalty. I will make one note about the contempt. One of the startling features of Abu Ali's case that I remember very searing for me as a young lawyer, his trial lawyer was appointed, and at some point he wanted his transcript. The transcript, it belongs to him, actually. So, it's very common for after trial for people in prison to want to see the record of what happened. And Abu Ali was asking for the transcript and asking for the transcript and asking for the transcript, and the lawyer couldn't be bothered to send it. He couldn't be bothered to make the copies and couldn't be bothered to put it in the mail and buy the postage and send it. And on one of the letters that was in the file, we got the file when we got involved, there was a note scrawled. This is his trial lawyer. This is not his Abu Ali's, I'm not talking about his post-conviction lawyers, just so you know. Bill and Brad, great. There was a note. And the note was from the lawyer to the secretary. He had a secretary. It said, send this motherfucker his transcript. The contempt took my breath away. I couldn't imagine a lawyer. A lawyer, you are a mouthpiece for the weak. I couldn't imagine talking about any client that way. I certainly couldn't imagine talking about this man that way, this particular person. But that is what he had to work with on account of his poverty. And that's not unusual. It's not unusual. I think those of us that live in New York, New York is a special place in a lot of ways, and our defense function here is very good, and you may know defense lawyers and they're great. It's not like that in Tennessee. It's not like that in Alabama. It's not like that in poor places. Okay, I'm going to stop now. Actually, I'm not going to stop now. I'm going to say one more thing. I do think that we are at a moment where we can change this. Things are changing. And we are talking about mass incarceration. We are talking about the death penalty. And my request to you as a lawyer, like I spend all day yakking in court, writing briefs, trying to reduce the justice to these legal arguments they fail to capture all that is wrong here. But that's not a limitation that people have in public discourse. And my request to you is to stay attentive and stay on point, to show up when your representatives are taking up these issues that affect the ability of people to confront charges against them. And with that, I will turn the mic over.
Thank you. And our last presenter is Ndume Olatushani, who he knows all the men in this exhibition. He spent 19 years on death row in Tennessee, almost 28 in prison before being exonerated of the crime he was convicted of committing. And we wanted to have him here not just because he knows all the men in the show, but also because he can testify firsthand to some of the injustices within the system where they are living today. So if you could just join me in welcoming him.
Good afternoon, everybody. And I want to start first by saying I really appreciate this opportunity to be up here with these guys. And they're doing a lot of good work, the stuff that they're doing. And it's really an honor of mine to actually be here. And I certainly appreciate you guys coming out and hearing what we got to say. I think it's some really important issue. I'll first start by saying that everything that could have possibly went wrong in a death penalty trial went wrong in my trial. You talk about some of the issues that allow for me to end up spending nearly 28 years in prison and 20 of those years on Tennessee's death row. That like I said, every thing that could possibly go wrong in a trial went wrong in mine. First off, I start by saying that I was actually born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri, and as crazy as it sounds, I had never even been to the state of Tennessee until I was actually taken in handcuffs and chains, shackled like some imaginary monster, and put on trial for this crime. The crime actually happened in 1983. So I was this young black male. When you talk about race, I don't know what you guys know about Memphis, Tennessee, but if you know anything about Memphis, Tennessee, you know it's not a white city. It's a majority black city, but I was this young black male being accused of killing this white prominent person in the city of Memphis, and the prosecutors was able to have me tried by an all-white jury. And from the time that when you talk about lawyers, and I'll give you a real quick story about when I first went to Memphis and I was down in the Memphis County Jail, the Shelby County Jail, talking to guys about trying to possibly talk to an attorney to represent me. I finally got this guy's name, Marvin Ballard. He still practices down there now. I called him on the phone. He came over to the jail and sit down and talk with me. A couple of days after I talked with him, he said that he had no problem in representing me. The only thing he wanted was his retainer fee that he was requiring up front. The money was paid to him, and he came back within a week or so after, like he said, that he would actually come back, sit down and talk to me about strategy and how we move forward. Long story short, he came back, and basically he came back and was telling me he looked into my case, and he realized that he ain't gonna have enough time to actually do it, and so he was telling me this stuff, and I was thinking when he's telling me this, and I actually said to him, well, you knew it was a murder case when we sit down and talk before, so I just kind of pushed back on him a little bit about what he was telling me, and basically was trying to figure out why he was trying to opt out of, represent me based on the earlier conversation we had. And in essence, what he told me was that he had looked into my case. It was a lot of pressure from downtown to actually solve the case, and he didn't want to be involved in it. So when he told me this, he gave me the money back. That was not an issue. He gave me the money back and just said that he didn't want to be involved in it. And so he didn't really have to spell out in detail why he was opting out of it. When I look back now, I really appreciate the integrity that he actually showed in doing what he actually did. And it wasn't until years later that, I began to understand what it is that he actually found out that, he didn't want to be involved in. And I certainly won't try to go into the evidence in my case because I spent 28 years in prison, and all the way up until I walked out June 1st of 2012, we was filing stuff in court, so we got papers, so I won't try to get into all that. But one of the things that happened, two of the things that happened, I think is pretty, significant in my case. First off, the prosecution, they knew I was innocent of the crime. They withheld all the evidence of my innocence when they fabricated evidence to make me look guilty. Like I said, the case happened in 1983. I was put on trial for it some 2 years after it actually happened, a little over 2 years after the crime happened. So at that point, the prosecutors, they wasn't really interested in solving the case. The only thing they wanted to do at that point was close the case. And so, like I said, while they was in court testifying about, they had the fingerprint examiner, for instance, to come in and say the car that was involved in the crime, that they had, taken a partial print of mine off the car, when in fact they was withholding the report showing that they had checked all the prints that came off the car, and my prints didn't match any of the prints that was on the car. Legally, they should have turned that information over to me, when I was going to trial, so a jury could have heard that, and they certainly wouldn't have told that lie had they stood up to their obligation and turned that information over. They was only able to do it because they withheld it. And so, and they also, like I said, while they was telling this lie, they also too went through this elaborate lab about where they found the print at. They also, too, withheld another report showing that the place that they claimed that they took my print, it was never even a print lifted from that part of the car. So, so this is, and then that's really significant because if you sitting on trial and the people say that the car that was involved in the crime, this person was actually in it, I mean, that's really kind of hard to overcome when you sitting down talking to people that's got common sense. And the other thing that I think was fairly significant in terms of, and this actually happened during my trial, that they brought in one eyewitness. They actually brought in two eyewitnesses, but one of the eyewitnesses that came in, he came in the morning, he came in and testified, walked the people through or they walked them through the crime. He told everything he said, and when they asked him, to identify the person in the courtroom, he said that he thought I was the person, 100% sure, but he thought I was the person. And so after he got off the stand, my attorney was finally able to get the judge to compel the prosecutor to give the statement that this witness had gave just minutes after the crime. And so based on that, the court sent the bailiffs out to his job, the sheriff out to his job, brought him back in court that afternoon so he can explain and answer some of the stuff that that he had said in this statement. And so when he came back to court and under recross examination by my attorney, he admitted in open court to this jury that the prosecutors and police had showed him several pictures of nobody but me and told him I was the person that committed the crime, and this was the only reason that he was actually identifying me. And I say this here because you would think that that would be enough for a jury to say, well, I mean, hold up, the only person that you bring in here in saying that they thought I was the person, he tell the truth about what actually happened. And if that wasn't enough, they brought another witness in, and we ain't found this out there years later either, that they brought this other witness in, and that seen the crime and was there on the spot, like this other guy. He said that I wasn't the person that committed the crime, that he had seen committed the crime. And so, like I said, you would think that this would be enough for a jury to say that, I mean, if nothing else, follow the law when it talks about reasonable doubt. But like I said, none of that stuff mattered. They, brought witnesses in, paid them to come in and lie and testify against me. And one of the things about the witness that said that I wasn't the person that committed the crime, years later he came forward and told us, when my lawyers contacted him, he, gave them an affidavit saying that the people had showed him not only several pictures of me and tried the same thing that this other witness they did with this other witness, but they actually went a step further with him. They showed him autopsy pictures of the victim, where this person laying out in the morgue, and and try to get him to come in and basically say what they want him to say. I guess depending on how you look at it, I guess lucky for me that he didn't do it, but. Like I say, so these are some of the things that that they actually came in, knowing full well that I wasn't the person that committed the crime. And so it was certainly, I mean, when I think back, it's like when I see this, these guys, I know all of these guys. I mean, many of them, all of them are good friends of mine. I spent years with them. And in fact, I inspired some of them to become artists. One of the things that happened for me while I was sitting on death row, real funny story. It was a guy on death row with me at the time, and he was an artist, and I commissioned him to do a portrait for me because I wanted to send it to my mother. And when he got through with the portrait, didn't look nothing like me, and nothing like me. And I'm wondering, and I mean, before I landed on death row, I didn't have no interest in art. I mean, I couldn't even draw a crooked line straight, and so. But when I'm looking at this so-called portrait, I'm thinking, man, I could have did a better job and kept my money. And so, and I didn't do it after then. One of the things that, I guess the thing that really actually, how art kind of found me after that incident, and even before I can actually send it to my mother, she was actually killed in a car accident. And so, so she never got to see it, but I was 2 years into being sitting on death row. I'm low in life. I'm already at the bottom, and so one of the things that I think, and it's probably true, I'm sure, for everybody sitting in this room, you never want to get a phone call, people telling you something that's wrong. But when you're sitting in prison, if the people come to your cell door and tell you, hey, listen, we need to take you to make this phone call home, something bad didn't actually happen, because they ain't giving out free phone calls. And so if they come to your door and tell you that, something didn't happen. And so when the people came to my door and telling me, hey, listen, we need to take you so you can make this phone call home. So already I'm thinking, I'm conjuring up all these bad things that my mother gonna tell me when I get on the phone about something that didn't happen to, somebody else in my family. But when I got to the phone, it was actually my sister telling me that my mother and a niece was killed in a car accident. And so at that point, when I hear this, you hear this stuff on, you see on TV sometimes in a movie, people getting this information and everything just start going in slow motion. It's like you're hearing, but you're not hearing. And for me, it really was happening like that. I mean, everything just kind of slowed down, and I'm hearing what my sister telling me, but then I ain't really able to process it because I wasn't prepared to get this information. And so, so finally, I snapped back to this reality. And but for me, it was at that point, because when that happened, I couldn't be hurt no more. I'm talking about, the world as I knew it was completely shattered, because the thing that I knew I had when I was sitting there was that if I ain't had nobody else in the world, I knew I had my mother. And so, and the thing that kind of helped pick me up was that the last time I seen her, which was probably not quite a year, last time I had seen her. And as she was leaving out of the visiting room, I just kind of jokingly said to her, "Oh, girl, I wouldn't know what to do if I ain't have you in my life." And it was really true. I mean, I'm telling you, she was with me when I knew the world was kind of against me. And so she just kind of looked back and said, "Oh, yeah, you're going to know exactly what to do when the time comes." And of course, neither of us knew that would be the last time we would actually see each other. But it was those words that I was able to resurrect when this thing happened, and was able to pick me up, because once I got this information, listen, for the first 3 days, I'm telling you that if my eyes was open, I was crying. If I wasn't crying, I was actually asleep. And on the third day while I'm laying down asleep, my mother came to me as clear as we sitting in this room, and the only thing she said was, "Get up." She probably would have said something else, but I jumped up so fast because it was so real. I'm thinking, man, this nightmare that I've been living is actually over. But I woke up to that reality. But it was then that, like I said, that I began to, I got up, like she said, but it was then that I began to able to just kind of put one foot in front of the other. And so as I'm just going through this process and going through this fire, like I said, there was those words that she said I was going to know exactly what to do and get up. And so I kept doing that, and so it was, like I said, it was at that point that I went back to what I was saying when I got that portrait in the cell, that I could actually did a better job and kept my money, that I began to draw. And so, and in a lot of ways, I mean, when you look at this stuff on the wall, I'm telling you, you don't know how important it is for those guys that's sitting there to not only have people out here, doing the stuff that we actually doing with their work and just letting people know about them. Because I'm telling you, every one of them deserve the same thing all of us got in this life in us. That art, for me, in a lot of ways, saved my life. It really did, because I was able to use art in this small space to create what I wanted to see, as opposed to this bleak environment that I was actually in. So in a lot of ways, like I said, it was the having the opportunity to create art that allow for me to maintain hopefully some sanity and sit before you guys today a whole person. So because sitting on death row is such a dehumanizing experience. Or it can be. I certainly didn't. I was one of them people that. I decided for the first 10 years that I was in prison, I decided not to have a TV in my cell because I didn't want to get lost in this small space. And at the time, it wasn't at River Bend. It was in the prison that was built in the 1850s, so you can imagine what that was. I mean, 4 feet wide and about 80, probably 9 feet long. We was in this little space. And so the whole process, like I said, is, can be dehumanized, and everything that I think that, this process is, I guess in the people these people that's over in charge of this thing, I guess in some ways it allows for them to do the work that they're doing, because if you can get somebody and dehumanize them, you have to be able to get outside of your own humanity and dehumanize people in order for you to certainly kill them. And so I think that, for the people that's involved in this whole, death industry, that they need to dehumanize people, so it would justify what it is that they're actually doing in the name of everybody that don't stand up and say something about it, really. But for me, like I said, I was one of them people that I knew I shouldn't have been where I was, first off. And one of the things that I vowed that what I would never let them do was create the person that they wanted me to be, as opposed to the person that I actually was. And so, with just that constitution, that I was able to, in spite of whatever they did, and like I said, if you can imagine being in a space, like I said, I can only stretch my arms out this wide, 23 hours of the day. People, you're doing everything in your cell. The only time you come out of your cell, as people, they either taking you to what they call a rec yard, which is really a cage, concrete cage. For 20 years, I was unable to walk on grass. And so, we was out this morning, me and Tom's dad, and we was in Prospect Park, and we walked by a tree. I'm sure it was several hundred years old, and I had to stop and look at it and just take it in, because I know that there's thousands of people walk by it every day and don't even appreciate the fact that they can walk by it, or what that really means. Because like I said, when you've been denied this opportunity to be around trees or even walk on grass, then we come to this place of understanding how important these things really are in life, that we take for granted every day. And so, but for me, like I said, I knew the one thing that I wouldn't let them take from me was, like I said, who I was and the person that I wanted to be. And so I was able to let go the anger that I certainly had and rightfully had for the people that, did what they did for me. And I don't even like to use the word forgiveness, because it wasn't really about forgiveness. It was what I needed to do to move forward for myself. I think that a lot of time that we get, kind of bogged down in this idea that, our happiness is contingent on something that somebody else need to do or have to do in order for us to, be happy. And the truth is that, for me, that, I knew that, if I was going to survive, then I couldn't look to, nobody else to somehow make that happen. You talk about, even when you talk about the death penalty, you have, victims' family members are set up with this idea that, once we, carry out this murder or this execution, that you're going to somehow, have closure and this stuff. And so when you take somebody in my case, that the people, the victim's family members sit for 28 years with this idea that I would be executed or for 20 years for sure, that I would be executed and they would be made whole and they can go on with their life. But the truth is that, I mean, the death penalty certainly doesn't do that. I mean, if you, I mean, I didn't had, family members murdered, and I never would wish the death penalty on nobody. But I also, too, realize and understand that, in order for me to move forward, it can't be based on this idea that something needs to happen to somebody else in order for me to move forward. And so as long as we stuck in that, then, the prosecutor is able to, put forth these lies and ideas that this is why we got this punishment, so you could be made whole. And the truth is that that's not going to do it. You got to get there some other way. And for me, like I said, I was able to pick myself up and, move forward in this way that allowed for me to maintain this thing that, like I said, I never internalized the belief that, and probably naively so, that I would be executed for something that I actually didn't do. But it was because I was able to hang on to that, it allowed for me to be preparing for freedom, trying to prepare for the day that I would come home, because in my mind, I always knew that, I certainly didn't think it would take 28 years, but I always knew that I would, the truth would prevail, and that I would come home. And so, so for me, like I said, I, did everything that I knew that I need to be doing. And there was people like these guys here that, came in that allowed for me to stay connected to the, the outside. I got a GED while I was sitting on death row, and that's, and I only say that to say, most people sitting on death row, and rightfully so, concerned about trying to save their life. And I was certainly doing the same thing. But while I was sitting on death row, I got a GED, took college courses, and, but for trying to save my own life, I could have got a college degree, but I chose to get in the law books. And the time that I was, doing this college stuff, and I let that kind of fall to the side. But when I look back now, I know I had it in me to do that as well too. I just I didn't do it. But one of the things that I would also too say, in spite of how people are treated, that the truth is that most people sitting in prison, and probably people on death row, a lot of these people gonna come home one day. I think that as a society, we have to decide how we want to bring people back home. Whether they're sitting in prison or certainly on death row, that we have to decide as a society how we gonna bring them people back home. I think that for me, I think that one of the things for me is that I think what the one thing that this process, going through that kind of process, taught me is that we're going to be knocked down by life, but the important thing is how we pick ourselves back up. I mean, if we never got knocked down, we won't be able to appreciate what it feels like to stand up. And so, so for me, I think that one of the ways that I kind of rationalize, why it happened to me, because I wasn't one of them people sitting on death row, why it happened to me. Here, most people that I met didn't even know my circumstance, because I wasn't one of them people that's, every time I meet somebody, I'm telling them about, I'm innocent and whatever the case is, because if you can't do nothing about it, it wasn't necessary for me to even be saying that, because the thing that I didn't want is what one of them guys said earlier about people trying to, if I come to you and tell you my truth, but you didn't get sucked into this idea where everybody in prison saying they're innocent, then rather than you seeing me for who I am, then you already kind of framed who I am based on this idea, oh yeah, everybody's saying what you saying. So for me, it wasn't important, to talk to people about, about that if you wasn't able to help me do it. And so, so for me, like I said, I think that, whatever fires that we go through in life, that, hell, if we get through to the other side, it ain't meant for us, it's meant for other people. We just have to understand that we charged with this responsibility, Because the one thing that I can say to people that, hell, if you keep getting up, everything's possible. You know what I mean? It's truly a miracle that I'm here. When you talk about somebody as a lawyer that's doing this here, you know how hard it is to, I mean, it's really an uphill climb. And so the fact that I'm sitting there, it really is a miracle. I mean, you know, I can't begin to tell you how much was taken from me, but I'm telling you, I sit there I feel like I'm such a fortunate man. I really am. You know, the fact that I'm actually sitting there, I mean, first off. But for me, I think that one of the things happened for me, I mean, a lot of things happened for me that made it possible for me to be here. But it was a law firm right here in New York that represented me. They took my case in '95 and got me off of death row, and they brought me home, like I said, June 1st of 2012. It's Cleary, Gottlieb, Steam, and Hampton. Their office is not too far from here. But these people worked on my case for 17 years.
David Harrington.
Yeah, David Harrington. David Harrington worked on my case. He was one of the lead lawyers. So he was supposed to try to come tonight, in fact. But these people, you know, like I said, it's a miracle. I was telling Tom them, you know, this morning that when these cases was going on in the South, since New York didn't have a death penalty anymore, that, you know, people was making a pitch to these law firms up here saying that y'all need to throw some of your resources at some of these cases in the South or whatever. And so they happened to be one of the law firms say, okay, yeah, we agree to take a case, you know, send us a case. So the story they tell is that they got one case, and you know, the facts were so horrible. They say, oh no, you send us another one. And so they sent another case, same thing. And they had this discussion at that point, according to them, that they had this discussion, look, we agreed to take a case. And so the next case come across our desk, we got to take it. You know, we just got to actually do it. And lucky for me, it was my case. And so, you know, like I said, they worked for 17 years, spent, I think, billed over 17,000 billing hours. You know, so I, like I said, even when I was sitting on death row, even before they actually came on my case, I knew that I was fortunate than a lot of people that I was sitting there because I had my family, I had people around me supporting me, and but you know, I knew that I was certainly fortunate when these guys came in and took my case. Like I said, it was a hard fight, but they brought me home, and I can't tell you guys how I'm truly happy. I've been telling people here lately that I'm happy as a lark. I really am. Yeah, I really am.
Ndume, one of the things that the guys told me on Thursday night was you got them into art. And so
Yeah,
they
yeah.
wanted me to thank you that.
Right.
And another thing they wanted to let the people here know is that there are no death penalty lawyers in Tennessee.
Right.
There's just no such thing. There's lots of prosecutors, I suppose, right? But there are no death penalty lawyers. No one is equipped to do that. So for these capital cases, how can that be? So.
Yeah. Yes, it really is some important stuff. I know that you guys don't have it up here, but you know, except for like she was saying about, I mean, federal death penalty is everywhere, but there's some really important stuff. It really is. I mean, but for, you know, good people getting involved in my case, I'm telling you, ain't no question in my mind that I wouldn't be sitting there right now. I would have been executed, and people would have been saying, you know, that I got exactly what I deserved. I was sentenced to die, and they carried out the execution. And so it take good people. You have to. I mean, if you know, in some ways, when they talk about the death penalty, it's probably true for a lot of things, but silence is complicit. I mean, we become complicit in our silence. You know, when we don't stand up for those things that we should be standing up for. You know, one of the things for me, and I'll be real quick, hopefully you guys, you know, got some questions. But since I've been home, I work for the Children's Defense Fund, and I don't know how much of you guys know about that, but it's a national organization, been around for over, I think about 45 years or so. And the whole issue that I've been focused on is this whole issue of this cradle prison pipeline issue. And it's some really important stuff. One of the things that I seen the nearly 3 decades that I was in prison was this whole exponential growth in the prison system. You know, prisons, it's an industry. I'm talking about billions of dollars is being exchanged in this prison industry. You got companies from Victoria's Secrets to Sears and a host of them in between. You can go on the internet and they'll tell you all the companies that's having their products made inside the prison here in this country. I mean, we hear about, you know, what China doing with their prisoners and or exporting jobs out of this country. A lot of jobs are actually being exported right into the prison system. You know, where they got people in there doing work for pennies on the dollar. And, you know, but, you know, the truth is that, like I said, it's a huge industry. With billions of dollars involved, that simply means somebody going to jail, bottom line. I mean, somebody going to jail. We know who's going, we know who's not going. And I'm saying that until we stand up and, you know, get on the front line of this issue, then, you know, it's going to continue in the way it is. One of the things that I think you said about when you look now, you got people out there talking about just a few years ago was talking about being tough on crime. You got some of these people now talking about there needs to be some reform to the system. And I'm saying that for those of us that care about it, our time is now. You got to get off the sideline. Our time is now.
Something to that, just on that thought, that whatever happens in the next 2 years will be called reform.
Right.
So we have to stand up to get what we need.
Yeah. Yeah.